Egyptian security agents arrest Mohammed Badi, spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, after days of hiding in Cairo. Simmering tension, uproar in Madagascar after the court bars candidates from elections. And the tricky business of wooing investors. Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta meets Chinese entrepreneurs in Beijing. Hello there, welcome to Africa Live, CCTV's new program that brings you African and global news from all perspectives. I'm Raman Yang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Here's what we're going to be doing today. We'll start this bulletin in Egypt with reports that the spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, Mohammed Badi, has been arrested in Cairo. Now, this comes amid growing tensions right across that country, and it forms part of a government crackdown on the organization as a whole. Recent violence in the country has prompted international condemnation and calls for dialogue between the interim government and Islamists. With the details, here's CCTV's Clementine Logan.
We will never give up Mohamed Morsi's presidency. The words of the Muslim Brotherhood's spiritual leader speaking last month. But in a further blow to the embattled group, Mohammed Badi is now being detained by police in Cairo. His capture reported on state television. Egyptian officials say Badi is being held in the district of Nasir City, the same place supporters of ousted President Mohamed Morsi held a 6-week sit-in that was cleared by security forces last Wednesday, sparking violent clashes. Since then, it's thought nearly 900 people have died. The authorities are cracking down on Muslim Brotherhood leaders and officials, detaining scores across the country. Badi and his powerful deputy Karet El-Shatta are due to go on trial later this month for their alleged role in the killing of 8 protesters in June. Elsewhere, security has been heightened in the town of Arish in the Sinai Peninsula after suspected Islamic militants killed 25 police officers in an ambush. It's the deadliest attack of its kind in years and came just hours after 37 Brotherhood prisoners were reported to have died in police custody. A spate of attacks in the region since Morsi's ouster has led some to speculate whether al-Qaeda-affiliated Islamists have links with the Muslim Brotherhood. Events in Egypt have prompted international condemnation, and efforts to curb escalating tensions are underway. On Monday, UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon urged an end to the violence.
On Egypt, I'm alarmed by ongoing developments and the widespread outbreak of violent protest and the excessive use of force. I strongly condemn attacks on churches, hospitals, and other public facilities. There is no justification for targeting civilians or destroying infrastructures and property so important for Egypt's future. Preventing further loss of life should be the highest priority.
On the same day, US Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel urged Egypt's military to encourage dialogue and take an inclusive approach. But he also admitted Washington's limited influence following the crackdown by security forces.
The violence must end. National emergency lifted. The interim government of Egypt must get back to an inclusive approach to reconciliation in Egypt.
The US State Department also said, however, that it hadn't yet decided to put a blanket hold on the $1.3 billion in annual military aid to Egypt, and expressed continued hope for the country's rocky transition to democracy. Clementine Logan, CCTV.
CCTV's Adel Bakhrouhi has been covering the crisis in Egypt from the time it started in 2011. He joins us now live on the line from the Egyptian capital of Cairo. Adel, let's start with the arrest of the Muslim Brotherhood's spiritual leader, Mohammed Badi. He's quite an important figure in that body. Can you tell us more about that arrest, the reactions to it, and what the likely fallout from that is going to be?
Well, this is the first time that we would see a spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood being detained by authorities. It has been known for quite a time that whoever rules Egypt, particularly since the 1952 revolution, Sadat, Abdel Nasser, and former President Hosni Mubarak particularly, never dared to arrest a Muslim Brotherhood Supreme Guide before, and this is because the main influence they had in the street. But yesterday, basically on Monday, there have been some plans for rallies all over the country, particularly Greater Cairo, and there was very few people only who showed up, which then might, analysts say, gave a feeling of security to the armed forces and the police troops that it might be safe, after all, to arrest the Supreme Guide Mohammed Badia. Mohammed Badia has been appointed only for just a couple of years ago, after the previous Supreme Guide decided not to continue his leadership of the Brotherhood, which was a first incident for the entire Muslim Brotherhood's history. Analysts say that there are contradicting actually analysis about how this would impact the crisis in Egypt. Some believe it would escalate tension, and they believe that without guidance or without leadership, the Muslim Brotherhood will not stop, but they will have small and dissipated attacks or protests in several parts of the country, which they believe might be controlled by the government, while others believe that this might be the beginning of a new wave of rallies and rage in the streets. It just depends on what will happen. But overall, we know that the Muslim Brotherhood has already appointed an interim Supreme Guide. Someone will just take temporarily the position until they have time for electing a new leader.
Indeed, funerals, of course, have also been held for the 25 officers who were killed in an ambush in the Sinai. Do we know how that ambush was set up, who was behind it, and how the government plans to react moving forward?
Well, there hasn't been a group or a party that took responsibility for these attacks. And on the other hand, the authorities did not say exactly who they hold responsible or accuse of killing those murders. But we know for a fact that the first reports about an RPG fired at their buses was not true. What happened is that some armed men or militants in Sinai, they stopped the buses, took out all of the 25 soldiers. They tied their hands at their back and made them sleep face on the floor, and then shot them in cold blood. This is basically what happened. But we also know that the authorities announced, the armed forces announced, that they had arrested 11 terrorists, according to their description, that might be involved in these attacks, but they do not identify who they are.
Indeed. Finally, let's talk about some unexpected allies. Officials in Israel, of course, have expressed their concern about the developments in Egypt, and to some extent some have even called for the Egyptian army to be supported in containing what they're essentially describing as Islamists. How have those comments been received in Cairo?
Well, it's always controversial whenever Israel talks about Egypt, whether it's criticizing or it's supporting. It's always a very big debate here. So basically, Sinai has been a spot, maybe one of the few mutual benefits between Egypt and Israel is to maintain a secure and a stable Sinai. Has been a gate for trafficking weapons and people through the gates into Egypt and into Israel, and also has been a source of supplying Gaza with weapons. So to both parties, the stability in Sinai is crucial. But the reaction on the Israelis, many people have condemned it. Particularly, we're talking on the street level. There has been no official statement or reaction so far. On the street, people do not like to hear about Israel interfering or following up their local affairs and trying to give support or criticism. And that's always a part of condemnation from the Egyptian public.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that update. That's CCTV's Adel Bakrouki over in the Egyptian capital of Cairo, where it is thought that at least 900 or so people have died since last week on Wednesday. Let's move on to the island of Madagascar, where efforts to break the country's political deadlock have been met with quite a bit of anger. Supporters of Lalau Ravlomanana, the wife of the deposed leader Mark Ravlomanana, said they would take to the streets after the electoral court there barred her from from running the elections. The Special Electoral Court also banned the incumbent head of state, Rajoelina, from standing in the polls on Saturday, in a move largely welcomed by Western and regional powers, including SADC, who say the country needs a fresh start with new candidates. The island has been in absolute chaos ever since Rajoelina seized power with military backing in 2009, scaring off investors and tourists alike. Rajoelina and Ravalomanana had reached a deal to restore order based on the condition that neither one of them would stand in future presidential elections. But when they both put their names forward, donors suspended financing and the African Union threatened to thereafter impose sanctions on the country. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. Moving on the business of wooing investors, Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta meets Chinese entrepreneurs in Beijing. And there's no let-up for Zimbabwe. The United States will maintain sanctions on Robert Mugabe despite pleas not to do so from SADC leaders.
We follow the latest trends in global politics, economics, culture and sport, and how Africa fits into the global picture. You decide what's important.
We need a trade justice.
Africa's future will be determined by Africa.
For women's equal opportunity, for a better life.
We have to change something, and it's not the outsiders.
Talk Africa, a new voice for the world.
Welcome back. Kenya's head of state, Uhuru Kenyatta, is in China on his first state visit as the head of East Africa's biggest economy to boost bilateral ties and balance trade relations between the two countries. Now, so far, the country's heads of state have signed some hefty agreements worth about $5 billion. On Tuesday, Kenyatta met with Chinese business representatives. He asked them to adopt business strategies that would help them boost the economy and grow jobs in a relative win-win approach. At the same time, he invited Chinese investors to look at government-led projects in Kenya, like the port of Mombasa, the pipeline and the road corridor linking Kenya, South Sudan and Ethiopia, as well as the Konza Technopolis near Nairobi, as well as projects in the energy, petroleum and tourism sectors. The Kenyan National Chamber of Commerce of Industry and its Chinese counterpart also signed a memorandum of understanding to encourage closer cooperation among their respective members. Right now, let's head off to Beijing for all the latest developments on the tour of the Kenyan head of state in China. Our correspondent Su Yuting has been following this fairly closely. Su, what's the latest outcome of the talks between Presidents Xi Jinping and Uhuru Kenyatta today?
Yes, China and Kenya have signed agreements worth $5 billion on Monday. Some $4 billion cover economic partnership, wildlife protection, and also a railway linking the port of Mombasa and the border town of Malabar. And Kenyatta said these railways are particularly important in the context of East Africa's common goal of quicker movements of people, goods and services. And another $1 billion covers is related to the energy-related projects. And Xi Jinping says that China will always support Kenya's quest for industrialization.
Indeed. $5 billion worth of deals on Monday. What other details can you give us about Uhuru Kenyatta's visit today?
Yes, Kenyatta and his delegation has met with representatives of Chinese business community in Beijing this morning. And you know that they have exchanged ideas on how to strengthen cooperation in trade and investment. China has become Kenya's second largest trading partner, and it has made great investment in Kenya while helping Kenyan people, helping them to build up schools and also improving infrastructure and also building hospitals and other facilities. So that it's very important for the business talking between the two sides. And the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang and also the top political advisor Yu Zhengsheng is scheduled to meet with Kenyatta this afternoon. And these talks will be surely very important because it will help boosting the political and economic partnerships between the two countries. Back to you.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that. That's CCTV Su Yuting in Beijing, China. She's been keeping tabs on the visit to China, the state visit to China by Kenya's head of state, Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta. Let's move on to Southern Africa now, where Zimbabwe's neighbours have urged the West to lift long-standing sanctions on Robert Gabriel Mugabe and his allies. That call came at this weekend's summit to the Southern African Development Community. But the EU says it's not yet ready to relax those sanctions. With the details, here's CCTV's Farai Mwakutuya.
Europe and the US imposed sanctions on Robert Mugabe and his closest allies over a decade ago, citing alleged rights abuses and rigged elections. But they said the sanctions could be lifted if July's vote was free and fair. Zimbabwe's ruling party, ZANU-PF, says it has now met that demand.
They say that they could not lift the sanctions until the election in Zimbabwe were held, and that those elections should be free, fair and credible.
The African Union and SADC have both hailed the election, and SADC is again pushing for the removal of the sanctions. Incoming chair, Malawi's President Joyce Banda, says Zimbabweans have suffered enough. But the US has signaled they'll stay. The European Union wants to see a final report from the SADC monitors before deciding. That report may not be released until the end of September. ZANU-PF says it will face what comes even if the sanctions stay.
We'll continue, as we have been doing for the last 13 years.
For now, the party is pressing on with plans to set up a new government. The first step towards that is the swearing-in ceremony of President-elect Robert Mugabe, which is due for Thursday this week. Farai Mwakutuya, CCTV, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Well, in response to the request by ZANU-PF, the United States says it does believe that Zimbabwe's recent election was flawed and therefore it doesn't plan to loosen sanctions against President Robert Mugabe's government until there's signs of change in the country. That's according to the State Department earlier on Monday, despite an endorsement of the vote by Southern African leaders. Mugabe, who has ruled Zimbabwe since independence from Britain in 1980, is set to be sworn in as president as early as this week, extending his 33-year stint in power after winning the elections on July the 31st. The 15-nation Southern African Development Community, which helped to broker a power-sharing deal after disputed elections in Zimbabwe in 2008, backed Mugabe's re-election on Sunday. The opposition Movement for Democratic Change, led by Morgan Tsvangirai, on Friday last week, dropped its court challenge to Mugabe's victory, saying it had doubt that it would get a fair hearing in Zimbabwe's courts. Over North African Tunisia, people assembled last Friday in the capital's avenue of Bourguiba, denouncing the Cairo unrest during the crackdown of the pro-Morsi sit-ins. The journalists representing Tunisian TV, the Tunisian news network, were harassed. CCTV reporters were also threatened while interviewing protesters there. The presidency in Tunisia, however, voiced what it described as, quote, total solidarity with the journalists last Sunday and denounced any form of violence against them.
The demonstration outside the Municipal Theatre of Tunis lasted more than 2 hours on Saturday. Several journalists are said to have been verbally and physically threatened by some Al-Mahaba movement members. However, Al-Mahaba movement representative Said Karchofi apologized to all the journalists following aggression towards some of them during the meeting of all the political parties.
We are good, we like all people, and we have good people, we like a job, no problem, and we like freedom country, and Tunisia is freedom country. Yeah, and we like all people from all the world, and you can come, no problem. We are good people.
Trouble started after one of the protesters began to prevent the interviewee from speaking to reporters who were covering the event. Each time he made an attempt to respond to questions from journalists, he was prevented from doing so. Several of his attempts to calm the agitated crowd failed. In response to the incident, the presidency asserted its determination to enforce law against anyone who uses or incites to violence against the media. The Al-Mahaba movement was formed on May the 22nd this year. The party champions for the establishment of a political and social program that will benefit unemployed citizens. Jean Chaos, CCTV.
Right, time to jump into business. Here's what's coming up next.